Hi everybody, and welcome to Big Joe's Journal. My name is Joe Tilden and I am the host of this program. Well, here we are in the month of June, summer's underway, and I think we're getting down to some serious politicking this week as far as the presidential election, which is still a number of months away. This week, of course, on NBC, and I believe MSNBC, and there's one other network connected with NBC. The 24 Democratic candidates square off in what is called a debate. It's actually not a debate. It's more or less a means of introducing the candidates to the public. Now, with 24, you say, how are you going to get so many in there? Well, it's going to go 12 and 12. And the way the lineups were set up, it was done by the luck of the draw. The result is that some of the heavy hitters will be on Thursday night. Now, this debate takes place from 9 to 11, June 26th, which is this coming Wednesday, and June 27th, which is this coming Thursday. And as I said, some of your heavy hitters are going to be, I believe, on Thursday night. Joe Biden, former Vice President, Bernie Sanders, who is currently running second, and I'm not sure where Kamala Harris is going to be, whether which night it's going to be on. But the presidential season has started. Actually, it was started last week in, I believe, Orlando, Florida, when the current incumbent announced his bid to run for re-election. And, of course, he has token opposition. That'll be the former governor of Massachusetts, Bill Weld. But, you know, the old saying, Bill Weld has about as much chance of being the Republican nominee as a snowball in hell. Today we're watching television around the noon hour, a news special, of course. The president has put some more sanctions on Iran. And, you know, this is something that bothers me. And I'm just afraid that he is going to hold off and declare war with Iran just before election time in an effort to get the country to say, well, we can't change leaders in the middle of a stream, and he will be reelected. Well, you say that's dirty politics. Well, not really. Richard Nixon did the same thing in 1972 to make sure he was being reelected. Rather than scale down the war in Vietnam, he picked it up by bombing raids into Cambodia and enlarged the war. The result was that the fatality total in Vietnam probably increased by another 8,000 to 10,000. And Lyndon Johnson, of course, escalated the war in Vietnam in 1964 to help his re-election efforts. Barry Goldwater came across as a war candidate, and Johnson supposedly for peace. But once he was reelected by a landslide, Johnson suddenly reversed himself. Well, so here we are in 2020. I think we have learned something from 2016, and that is that you got to have some credible candidates running. On the Republican side, of course, they're stuck with the individual that they have. Every poll that's been taken so far shows the number of Democrats being able to beat the incumbent, including the former Vice President Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders by, I believe, 10 or 11 points. In fact, Trump was so infuriated by the results of the polls, and taken by his own pollsters, mind you, that he fired them, claiming that they weren't doing the job. They didn't show him winning. Well, he wanted them to get some facts. They got the facts. Baby Donnie didn't like the facts. So he fired 3 of his pollsters. Well, that's the type of individual he is. And you kind of wonder when the election is over and he has to leave the White House, is he going to do it? Is he going to concede like a gentleman? Or is he going to stick in the White House until 12 noon on the 20th of January in 2021. 1 minute after 12, he's no longer president, and he'll be trespassing. So we'll see what happens. It's going to be very, very interesting, and a very, very interesting election. In fact, I think probably one of the more interesting elections that we've had. Probably the most interesting one since 2012. 2016, you had 2 unqualified people running. It was a disaster. But 2020, I think we're getting back on track. And that is going to start this week with the Democratic, and I hate to call them debates, they're not really debates. They're introductory sessions when each one will talk about their goal, what their objective is, why they're running for president. And you say, well, 24 is a lot of people, and it is, but this field will whittle on down. You've got the local caucuses in Iowa coming up, and that'll knock off a few. Then the primary in New Hampshire, we'll see a few more leaving after that. After South Carolina, a few more will drop out. And then after Super Tuesday, when I think there are 9 or 10 states holding their presidential primaries, you're going to see a lot more dropping out. And then you'll get down to the final 6 or final 8. The way I see it on the Democratic side, the final figures, I do believe, Vice President Biden, of course, the junior senator from Vermont, who's normally an independent, but becomes a Democrat when he gets presidential ideas, Bernie Sanders. Looking at number 3, that's a good toss-up. I think the junior senator from New Jersey, Cory Booker, might be running 3rd. The junior senator from California, Kamala Harris, will be in there. Certainly Elizabeth Warren, the junior senator from Massachusetts. So there's 5. Number 6, I would think the former congressman from Texas, Beto O'Rourke, should be in there. Possibly, since he's sort of a novel, and he's going to appeal to a lot of people, the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, might be in there. And another strong possibility is the senator from Minnesota, Amy Klobuchar. And we'll go there, and it'll boil down further from that. Well, what we were talking about last time was Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson, of course, was the 28th president. He was our president during World War I. The United States, getting into the war in 1917, made the difference and tipped the balance in favor of the Allies. And the result was that come November 11, 1918, Germany agreed to an armistice. And as part of that agreement, Germany agreed to become a republic. The result was that the Kaiser, Wilhelm II, had to abdicate, and he went into exile in Holland. Well, as Germany did something rather unusual for them and rather difficult, they did become a republic. And a German field marshal from World War I, Paul von Hindenburg, became Germany's first president under what they call the Weimar Republic. And of course, that didn't last very long. Hitler, when he came to power in 1933, put an end to that. Well, Woodrow Wilson was very, very popular in Europe. The United States had gone over there. They had defeated Germany, helped defeat Germany and Austria. It pretty much saved France and England and Italy and everybody else from German aggression. Woodrow Wilson, while he was very, very popular in Europe, in his second term was very much despised in the United States. One of the reasons was a couple of laws that he borrowed from the John Adams administration. The Alien Sedition Acts, which meant that if you criticized the government or the president, it was a federal crime, and you went to jail. A former congressman from Vermont, Matthew Lyons, had criticized the Adams administration, and he spent time in jail, but the people of Vermont kept reelecting him. Well, those laws went into effect in 1918, were pushed through Congress in 1918. The result was that in the elections of 1918, which were held just before the armistice, just a few days before the war came to an end, the country voted in a Republican-controlled Congress. Democrats had controlled Congress after 1912. When Woodrow Wilson came in, he brought in a Democratic-controlled Congress. And the same thing in 1914, 1916 when he was reelected. But mainly as a result of these Alien and Sedition Acts, a Republican Congress was elected in 1918 and took office in 1919. The result was the Alien and Sedition Acts were found to be unconstitutional and were repealed. They had been found to be unconstitutional to begin with, way back when John Adams was president, after Thomas Jefferson became president. But they were pushed through again and then found unconstitutional and repealed again. Wilson went over to Europe with a program that he said would ensure peace for the rest of the world. And people embraced this program. When he went to Paris, to the peace conference at Versailles, he was greeted overwhelmingly by French citizens as their liberator, the man that had set them free. Well, Mr. Wilson proposed his peace proposals, but our fellow allies were not that interested. One thing that did pass was the League of Nations. The League of Nations was established, and its headquarters would be in Switzerland, which had stayed neutral. Well, Wilson was a little disappointed that his proposals for peace had been rejected by France and Great Britain and Italy, pretty much. They wanted stricter controls put on Germany than what Wilson's peace plan proposed. And the result was that they rejected it. Wilson came back home. He was a very, very strong supporter of the League of Nations, which would ensure peace for the rest of our lives. Well, Congress wasn't buying any of it. And a spirit of isolationism had set in. The feeling in the country was, well, we saved Europe, we did our job, now it's their problem to rebuild themselves. And a spirit of isolationism took hold of the country. The result was that Wilson's plan to join the League of Nations was very soundly rejected, and the United States stayed out of the League. Well, Wilson, kind of overburdened by the disappointment, number one, that his peace proposal in Europe were turned down by our allies, that his drive to have us join the League of Nations was rejected by Congress, and other physical problems, he became a very, very sick man. And the result was that probably the last year of his administration, the country was probably governed by the First Lady. She pretty well closed off the White House to any outsiders, at least the presidential living quarters. And that's where Mr. Wilson stayed, and he did not make any public appearances that year because of his illness. They say the country was probably run during that year by his wife, who, by the way, happened to be his second wife. His first wife had died a few years earlier. And she, in connection with the vice president and probably a couple of his closest advisors, pretty well ran the country. Well, the result was that in 1920, the pendulum swung back and the Republicans regained control of the White House. The Democratic ticket that year had a former senator from Ohio running for president and a former Assistant Secretary of the Navy by the name of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, candidate for vice president. The Republicans went out to Ohio and nominated a Senator Warren G. Harding as their candidate for president. Now, of course, you didn't have TV. Radio was fairly new at that time. Supposedly, Mr. Harding didn't do a heck of a lot of campaigning. They say he campaigned from his front porch. But he did a lot of radio work, broadcasting from his front porch. Let me see. The Democratic nominee was named Cox. I'm sorry. His name was Cox. And Franklin Roosevelt was his running mate. The result was that Warren Harding was elected president. Now, was Warren Harding our most dishonest president, or was it Richard Nixon? Or was it George Bush? Well, I think the honor for being our most dishonest president has to go to the incumbent. But Warren Harding, well, he certainly was a womanizer. Supposedly, he had a lady in every closet. Mrs. Harding stayed home. She stayed in Ohio. She didn't go to Washington. She stayed in Ohio. And I would imagine she got a good sum of money not to file for divorce from your Republican big money people. But Warren G. Harding became our president. And with him came a number of scandals. The Attorney General of the United States became the first U.S. Attorney General to be forced to resign and went to federal prison. And many of Mr. Harding's cabinet members came close. Number one, going to prison or getting probationary sentences. Well, the result was that Harding died before he completed his first term. Some people think it may have been suicide, and everything sort of points to the fact that Warren Harding committed suicide. He was succeeded by, believe it or not, the 30th President of the United States, who was Calvin Coolidge. And we all know the story of Coolidge, how he got word in the middle of the night that the president was dead and that he was now the president. And the oath of office was administered to him by his father, by lantern light or whatever at their home in Plymouth, Vermont. And so Vice President Calvin Coolidge became the 30th President of the United States. And of course, here in Vermont, you know, if you say anything bad about Calvin Coolidge, well, you sort of sold your Vermont legacy down the river. But the fact of the matter is that beginning with Harding and under Calvin Coolidge, crime soared in this country. You had the mafia, you had Cosa Nostra. The big thing that drove it at that time was prohibition. You know, the 19th Amendment had gone through. They restricted the sale of hard liquor and all that. Well, the result was that you had booze being smuggled in, mainly from Canada and from the Caribbean. You had what they call bathtub booze, people mixing up their own drinks. And control of the bootleg trade became very, very financially rewarding. The result was that Cosa Nostra and a number of these gangster families gained control of the bootleg trade. Well, Calvin Coolidge, of course, was a Republican. He was a Vermonter. He was also very strong in support of big business. He was also known as the Union Buster. When he was the governor of Massachusetts, he busted a strike by police officers in Massachusetts. And it's because he was the governor of Massachusetts that he was picked to be Senator Harding's running mate in the 1920 election. On Senator Harding's death, or suicide, or whatever, Calvin Coolidge became president. Under Coolidge, there were a number of tariffs, such as we have now. And what this did was to set the stage for the Great Depression that would occur under his successor. A number of other problems under Mr. Coolidge. Soldiers that served in the Army or any of our other military services in the Navy during World War I were promised a bonus. Well, these guys came home expecting that bonus, and it was never there. The result was that a number of World War I veterans got together and decided to march on Washington. Well, a fellow named Douglas MacArthur was the Army Chief of Staff at the time. And as these veterans marched on Washington demanding their promised government a bonus, it was MacArthur and the regular army that stood against them and turned them back. One of the younger officers under MacArthur at that time was Dwight David Eisenhower. And the Veterans March on Washington more or less became a failure because of MacArthur and the regular army standing against them and turning them away. Big business boomed under Coolidge. People being totally unaware that the foundations of this boom were just not there. And it was just a matter of time the whole thing would collapse. In 1928, Mr. Coolidge, having served part of Harding's term and a full term of his own, Coolidge ran for election on his own right in 1924 and was overwhelmingly elected. The country, for the most part, felt good under Cal. Reportedly, people said, he didn't say much. He said just a few words. There are a number of stories about Calvin Coolidge, about how he said at a banquet one time, and a woman sitting next to him said, "I have a bet on that you will probably say more than 2 words tonight." Coolidge looked at her and said, "You lose." Here in Vermont, of course, Calvin Coolidge, he's one of our icons here. But as President of the United States, even though he presided over a time of, I won't say at least worldwide tranquility, but under his administration, there are a lot of things happening. The number of tariffs that we had, the number of errors left over from World War I, for example, the Army bonus that never came about. And in Europe, a deep depression was setting in over there, which would open the door for a crackpot like Adolf Hitler to move into the spotlight and take control. And the damage that he did. Some of Coolidge's motto was, "What's good for business is good for the country." What's good for business is good for the country. As I said, Coolidge was also a union buster. So labor unions during the Coolidge administration struggled. Much of big industry was controlled by the gangster element. It was very, very common when you hear about these eliminations For example, the boss of one gang would order a hit on one of his rival gangs, and it would take place. The hitman would be arrested and go to jail, probably make big money for his robbing out of this effort. Well, with the coming of Herbert Hoover, Hoover was an engineer by profession. He's a graduate of Stanford University from the state of Iowa. Herbert Hoover was a very intelligent man, very sharp man. But what he inherited from Calvin Coolidge was a country that was on the verge of sliding into a depression. Well, when Calvin Coolidge took the oath of office in March of 1929, he made promises he couldn't keep. He promised that nobody in this country would go hungry. There'd be a chicken in every pot, a car in every garage. Cars were something new, fairly new in those days. Henry Ford made a fortune manufacturing what they call the Model T. He says, we've got all kinds of cars, as long as you don't mind having a car colored black. There was the way of starting the car. Originally, there was a hand crank, where you'd get out in front and crank the engine and get it going that way. Later on, we'd have the starter inside the car. There is a motor vehicle regulation in Vermont that has never been repealed. And fortunately, it's never going to be enforced. The legislature in Vermont back in the late 20s passed a law regarding motor vehicles because the main way of travel in Vermont was by horse. And the rule was that if you're driving at night, you got to have somebody going at least 8 feet in front of you carrying a lantern. And you can follow them in the car. Now that person can be walking or he can be on horseback. Most of them are on horseback. But if you're going to drive at night, you'd have somebody going in front of you with a lantern. Because, you know, those cars, they hadn't come up with the headlights yet and all that stuff. That would come a little bit later on, probably right around 1929, 1930 or so. But when automobiles first went into force in Vermont, that was a rule and regulation. If you didn't do that, you didn't drive at night. And also another interesting thing, the first highway fatality in Vermont occurred in Waterbury. Car hit a bull. And I'm not sure whether the bull lived or not, but the driver of the car was killed. And that was Vermont's first highway fatality. Well, as we say, Coolidge took office 1929. Nobody really foresaw the disaster that was going to hit later on that year. But things began coming together. And on October 29th, 1929, that fatal day when the stock market collapsed, and when it did, many people that had their fortune tied up in the stock market and investments. You had suicides all over the country. People lost their fortune, weren't sure how they were going to live. In New York alone, people were jumping out of 40, 50-story windows. A time of great, great tragedy in the country, and not only this country, but the entire world would go into the Great Depression. And Herbert Hoover, as brilliant as he was unable to push through any laws or anything to try to turn things around, try to stop what was happening. In other words, it was like an avalanche, the loss of jobs. And of course, it would take a change of administration and some new programs, things that people at that time were calling socialism, that would turn this thing around. What actually ended it, of course, was World War II. So next week, we'll discuss a little bit about the Hoover administration and then get into the Roosevelt administration. Have a great week. May Almighty God, in His infinite wisdom, continue to bless these United States of America. God love you, and have a great week. We'll see you all next week.